Data validation is extremely important. The problem is that it can create a lot of excess code. Plus, you end up in the position of having similar validation code throughout your application, violating the dry principle. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to Fluent Validation, a free tool to help make your validation clean, easy to create, and easy to maintain. As a bonus, it even works on models that you don't own and can't change. Now, if you're new to this channel, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. Whether you're new to C# or have used it for years, you should be able to find something here that will benefit you. One of the biggest ways you can see improvement in your C# skill is through practice. Make sure that whatever you learn, you practice. That's why I have an ongoing series on Thursdays called the Weekly Challenge. I would encourage you to participate each week to make sure you keep your skills sharp. Okay, let's get started. Now, as you can see, we're starting out with some code already written. If you want to have a copy of this starter code, or if you want to get the code from the end of this video, follow the link in the description below to go to the blog post entry for this video. Now, I've got a form project here, dashboard form, where we create a user, first name, last name, account balance, and date of birth. Now, there's not much here, but behind the scenes, let's just look real quick just to show you what code there is. We have a binding list that binds to our errors list, which isn't even wired up yet. It's just basically a list of string. It's not even wired yet to our error list box. Then we have this create button click. And again, there's code behind here. And as I've mentioned in previous demos, I'm going to mention here as well, this is demo code. So to be clear here, I wouldn't normally put all this code in this button click event. I usually have it, if I could, in a different layer of my application, or if I was going to pull this information out, I would have it at least in a different method. But there it is, just because this is demo code. So what it does is it clears the errors out. That's that list up here. And then it has a try parse on the account balance. And once it's done that, as long as it works, if it does not work, it puts an error there and says, hey, that's a bad balance, and returns. But if it works, then it creates a new person model, which is this person right down here, this model, which has first name, last name, account balance, and date of birth, which sounds familiar. So we put our first name text into first name into last name, account balance into account balance, and date of birth into date of birth. So pretty simple stuff, but we're getting information from the user. And one of my very foundational tenets of programming is never trust the user. And that's not to say that we're saying users are bad, but users will find a way, usually accidentally, to give you data you never anticipated. One of my common examples is you ask a person for their age and you expect them to give you a number, as in 1, 2, 3, 4, but in numeric form, and they give you TEN. Well, that's not a number, that's a string. But they don't know that. That's a number to them. So you wouldn't necessarily think of that. So when we get information from the user, we shouldn't put it straight into the database. So that's kind of what we're doing here. I'm just simulating that. I'm not actually going to do it, but this would be a step to insert this into the database. So what I do here is somewhere up in here, I would validate my data. Okay, and validation, in case you're not familiar, just means that I need to make sure that it's, as much as I can, that it's valid data, as in real data. So for example, a person's first name needs to have something in it. Same with last name. And account balance, we really can't check that unless we have some rules around it. So for example, as long as it's a number, is that invalid? Like the account balance could be a negative. Maybe they bounced a check or something like that, in which case it's a negative, or they owe something. And 0 is a valid balance because maybe they have no money coming in or going out. That's a 0 account balance. So that might not be something we can check unless we have some rules around it. For example, maybe this is a particular kind of checking account where you have to have a balance of at least $5,000 in order to maintain this type. That can be something we check. Date of birth. Well, a date of birth probably can't be in the future. I know it can't be in the future. And it probably won't be something that is more than, let's say, 120 years ago, because that's older than the oldest person on the planet. So that's a range we can put in the date of birth. So to validate these things, we could put these checks into place. But all of a sudden, we're starting to write this complex code, or at least a number of checks. So if we put the checks right here, where we check as soon as it comes in, first name, check to make sure it's a valid name. It's not null, it's not white space, and it's got at least one character in it. Same with last name. Account balance, maybe we'll say that yes, the rule is at least $1,000 in the account. So we could check for that as well. And date of birth, we're going to check that it's not greater than today and it's not older than 120 years ago. So those are checks we could put in place. And if we put them right here, that would make sense for this particular form. But what if we had a different form that also gathered information about the user? Well, then we've got to do validation there as well. And so then we think about, well, maybe you could put it in the model itself. And sometimes that works, and you can even do decorators, which those are nice, and I've done a video on those. But maybe you don't control this model. Maybe this class library is actually a DLL, and you don't have access to make modifications to it. Or maybe you just don't want to pass all that data around, those methods around with it, because you want to use it other places or in different ways. Or you want to swap out which ones you use. Well, then you got to create a different place for all of this. And so it kind of becomes a little bit of a depends on your circumstances type of answer for validation. Well, today we're going to look at Fluent Validation, like I said. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in the front end. Now, you don't have to do this. And in fact, it might not be the right place for you. It might be better to put it in the library for you with your models. But in this case, I'm going to put it in the front end because of the fact that I want to simulate the idea of I have no control over this library. So we're not going to change anything in this library. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a reference in NuGet. So manage NuGet packages in my dashboard UI. I'm going to search for Fluent Validation. There we go. And the red asterisk is the one you want. It's been downloaded 9.3 million times, so it's a very popular library. And it's actually got a lot of add-ons as well, but we're going to use just this Fluent Validation for today. So install that. For me, it's version 8.1.0. And notice down here, it will work with .NET Standard, .NET Framework, and other versions of the standard and framework, which also means it works with .NET Core. So that's a really great thing, because we can take this to any either ASP.NET or Windows Forms or console application, WPF, or even Xamarin, iOS, those type of things. We can take Fluent Validation with us for those things. So this is a truly cross-platform tool, which I try to make all my tools cross-platform because of the fact that, you might need to go that direction someday. So let's just check real quick and see annotations we can upgrade if you want to. I'm going to leave that as is. We don't need to do that. Now that's all we need to do to prepare for annotations or for this Fluent Validation. So I'm going to right-click on my UI and create a folder for the validators. I'm actually going to call it validators. And in here, let's create a person validator, which is a class. So person validator. I'll make it public. And I'm going to inherit from abstract validator. Control dot to bring in the using Fluent Validation. And this is going to validate the person model. Okay, so I specify that this person validator is going to validate the person model. Now notice this is in the UI project, and yet I'm validating something somewhere else. In this case, somewhere I'm simulating I have no control over. You could put this in the same library and it'd be just fine. So this right here will be the tool that we use to validate the person model, which means that all the code for validation will be in one spot and it will be attached to the person model without being tied to it. Meaning the person model can move around. We can have different validators also for the person model, so you can kind of swap them out. And yet everybody has access to this validator to use it if we want to. So a validator is pretty simple. Let's create a constructor. That's where the validator kind of lives. And let's create our first rule. We say rule 4. And we do our open parens. And we give it a name. It's going to use an arrow function or a lambda function. So we get to choose what our variable name is. Let's call it P for person. And we'll do our arrow function and say P.firstName. So let's say, okay, we're going to work on the first name property. So it's going to be a rule for the first name. We say dot, and here's all the potential rules we can do and other actions. And there's a lot in here. But let's start with something simple, not empty. Now, what is not empty? If we look at this list here, it says defines a not empty validator. That's great. It will fail if the property is null, is empty, or is the default value for the type. So that covers quite a few different options for our first name. Now, let's leave it just like that with nothing else. We created one rule. That's it. I'm going to save that. And now let's come over to our dashboard here. We're going to validate our code. Now the validation, I'll put it all in one spot so you can see it. So person validator, which we have to add the using statement for. Let's call it validator equals new person validator. And they can say, I'll show you the results, but let's just do var for now. Results equals validator dot validate person. So we're passing in our newly created person object. We're saying, go ahead and validate this. And the results that come back is called a Fluent Validation .results.validation result. Okay, so that's what's coming back. We could say validation result, like so, and then do our control dot and add this second using statement, Fluent Validation.results. But if you want to just do var, that's okay as well. It's kind of up to you. I usually shy away from var for simple types, but when it's complex like this and it's obvious what it's for, then I sometimes use var. So it's up to you. Okay. So we've just said, go ahead and validate this person. So what it's going to do when we create this person validator, it sets up these rules. Now you notice there is no validate method in my validator. That's because in the abstract validator. Okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here about setting up, and there's validate. So it passes back a validation results, and that's kind of the information about it. So what's going to do is when we call the validate method, it's going to say, is this a valid method or model based upon the rules you specified? We only have one rule, and the rule is that first name can't be empty. So let's go ahead and create the if statement here. If results dot is valid equals false. Okay, so results.isValid, that's pretty self-explanatory. If it's true, then it is valid. If it's false, it's not valid. So I'm going to check for false here. Then what I'll do is I'll do a for each, and we'll say, I believe the string failure in results.errors. So errors, actually no, it's a validation failure. There we go. So now we have a list of errors we can look through if this model is not valid. So let's, for each validation error, let's add it to our errors list. Okay, so we have our errors dot add. We add a string, so let's create our string interpolation. And we'll start off with just the name. So failure dot property name. And then the format we used up here was, this is the name, and then colon, and then the error. So let's say colon, and the error is failure dot error message. Okay. So what's going to happen is if we fail the validation, it's going to loop through every error we get back, because we can have more than one error. And if we get back more than one error, that's going to mean there's 2 entries here, or 3 entries, or 5 entries. And it's going to loop through each one or more, and add that to our errors list. So let's go wire this errors list up. So our error list box dot data source equals errors. And that should do it. We can verify that by putting in a couple of bad values, or just one bad value actually. We know that the account balance, if we put test here, we hit create, it's an invalid amount. So let's put a 0 there, and let's put nothing for first name either. The operation's complete, but first name must not be empty. Now, where did that message come from? Well, that came from our validation, because it failed validation. So if I put test here, operation's complete, no errors in the list, because test could be a valid name. So that's really all there is to validation. It's pretty simple stuff. But here's the cool thing is we're not done here. We can chain more things to this rule. For example, okay, the first name is not empty, but what if it's 100 characters? That doesn't seem like it's a valid first name either. And probably not 1 character. That's an initial, it's not a name. I would think the first name has to have at least 2 characters. So if we said that's the rule, I'm not sure if it would be or not in my case. In the real world, I'd probably say as long as 1 character more, call it good. But probably not last name. Last name probably has to be 2 characters or more. But in this case, let's just do 2 characters or more. So let's just say the length, and this is the cool thing. Again, it's provided, but we have this exact length here. But maybe you don't want that. Maybe instead we want a min and a max. That sounds better. So let's say that minimum is 2 characters and maximum is 50 characters. Since our database table only accepts up to 50 characters, that seems like a good validation rule here is we stop the user and say, nope, if your name is more than 50 characters, then it's going to have a problem in the database, so let's tell you right up front. And maybe you can use a nickname, or maybe you can rethink the name you were putting in, because maybe you were putting in 3 names, your first and middle names, or something like that. So now length of 2 to 50. Now that error message wasn't the greatest. So what if we said with message and said, please provide a valid first name. Like so. That's, more stuff attached to that first name rule, but now we're kind of dialing in the rules to this first name. Let's run it again. First name, create. Oh, I got an invalid account balance. First name. First name must not be empty, and please provide a valid first name. Okay, so what happened here? Well, it ran both rules, and the second one has a message. No problem. Here's what we're going to do. We can use our enter key. This is kind of nice. The enter key allows us to put multiple lines and kind of shrink down the width of this line so it's not so long. And yet at the same time, it's still one line as far as the compiler is concerned. So what we can do now is we can actually put another message here. Let's actually just copy this and paste it. But I'm starting to get long names here. Let's change these to something shorter. So not empty is, let's say the first name is empty, like that. And for this one is length of first name invalid. Okay, and it may not quite as short as I would hope it to be, but that's getting us there. And let's run that real quick and see it working. So first name we're going to leave blank. We'll put a value in for our account balance and hit create. Now it says the first name is empty, and it says the length of first name is invalid. So we're getting both of those messages, which is, we now have both custom messages, but what if we didn't want both messages? Because why tell them that it's empty and the length is invalid? So what we can do is we can add one more property at the beginning. Let's say cascade. And this is a rule essentially against the rule. So here's how you're going to process cascading. So cascade mode, let's say that it is stop on first failure. Now notice, you say dot this, and then dot this, and then dot this. Just keep adding and extending this rule. So now we're going to stop on the first failure. That's just for this particular rule. So we're gonna, if this rule, the not empty rule, fails, it's not going to check the length. Let's validate that or verify that. So my account balance is 1. Now we have one error. First name is empty. Well, let's put T in there. Now the first name is not empty, but the length of first name is invalid. So let's put another check in place for this string because it is a string. And if I were to put 1, 2, 3 and go, oh, no, I'm at account balance, but never change my first name, that says it's a valid name. There's no error here saying that's an invalid name. But 1, 2, 3 is not a valid name. And that's where you might have to deviate outside of the standard built-in rules that are provided for you. That's not a problem. We're going to create, let's call it a protected method. So protected bool be a valid name. We'll say string name. So this is going to sound a little weird, be a valid name. But when we put it in the context of our rule, it'll make sense and it's going to read very easily. Because so far we read very easily. Rule for first name, cascade, the stop on first failure. If it's not empty with message, a length with message. So it kind of reads almost like just normal English. Yeah, it's a little stilted. It's got a couple of quirks, but it's very easy to understand. We want the same thing for our method names. So this is a custom rule we're going to create. And for this rule, what we're going to do is we're going to strip out a couple of the characters that are okay to be in a name, but they're not alpha characters. And by alpha, I mean ABC. But beyond that, there's also other characters that may be in there, with accent marks, things like that. We're going to check for all of those, but first we'll strip out a couple. We'll strip out space and we'll strip out the dash because those could be in a name. So we're going to say name equals name.replace, and we'll replace a space, and it has to be double quotes here, not single quotes. We'll replace that with an empty string. So it's replacing a space with an empty string, and we'll also replace the dash with an empty string. Now, typically the replace we do a char, which is a single quote. But since we want to put an empty string in place, we have to use double quotes. It's a quirk. Okay, so we don't really care about this name, so that's why we're modifying it. We're just checking to make sure that it has only valid characters. So I stripped out the two that might otherwise cause a problem with this. Return name.all. This is going to check every character in this name. I'll say char.isLetter. And the isLetter will check for any valid letter. And that's Unicode letter. So it does do the accent characters and other things that aren't in a US standard keyboard. Okay, so this allows us to go a little more international with our wording, which probably might affect you. It probably should, because usually a name database is going to be international. So with this, what's going to do is return name.all. And what all does is says, does every character in this sequence pass the it's a letter test? So we're going to go through every character and check to make sure it's a letter. That's why I pulled the space out first and the dash out first, because those are not letters, but they are valid for a name. So if all of them are letters, now that we've removed the two non-letters that are okay, then it's going to return true. Otherwise, it'll return false. Let's add this test at the end. So must be a valid H. Okay, now I can add, valid name, not a valid H. Be a valid name. And we're going to add the with message. And we'll say that name, we'll say first name contains invalid characters. Like so. Now notice I'm typing first name a lot. So we're going to get back to that in just a minute, but let's verify that this works first. So let's get back here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, create. First name contains invalid characters. So now it's failing. But if I were to say TEST, that's a valid name. So there we go. Now we have a name check that's a little more granular in its check. But we're still, like I said, using this first name over and over again, which is especially problematic because once I get this rule done, I think this is pretty good. Once I get it done, I'm going to copy the whole thing and paste it for last name. Well, let's use one of the built-in variables that the Fluent Validation provides us and say property name. So we replace that everywhere. It's just in curly braces, and it's right in a string, no $sign on the front or string.format necessary. And the really cool thing here with the property name is when it looks at a property name and sees first name and the F and the N are capitalized, and it says, okay, those are two different words. Therefore, I'll split them apart and put a space in between. Let's see this run again. And I'm going to say, I'll leave it empty. Create. First name is empty. Well, let's put something in there. Length of first name invalid. T2. First name contains invalid characters. So now it's telling me that the field name in my string, which means I don't need to have this at the beginning probably. In fact, let's get rid of it. That'll save us some space. And let's just actually say, we'll just add just the error message. Like so. And now if we run this, we do this, it just has the error message. And since it says first name, we know which property it applies to. So we can use these variables to tell us information about what we're checking against. But also, we could say this length right here, well, how many characters was it? So what if it was more than enough characters? Maybe it's 51 characters. We could take one off. But if it's 101 characters, well, that's a little harder to deal with. We have to do something different. Telling the user that would allow them to make a choice. So let's put it inside parens right after length and just say just a number. So we'll put inside curly braces total length. And this only works for string fields, but it's kind of handy. Total length. So now, if we run this again, and I'm going to put a 1 here, and let's first of all put just one letter in. Length 1 of first name invalid. That's okay. But what if I just started typing letters like crazy and hit create? 105. So now if I take off, let's take off half the G's, or more than half. There you go. All the G's. I'm down to 73. I'm making progress. Okay? So you can very easily see, I'm only 6 away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go. But if I put a K in there, I'm sorry, you're 1 over. So that allows me to know exactly where I'm at in the validation. It's, just a little outside or it's way outside. So more information you can provide to the user, the easier it makes their job in fixing the errors. So there's a number of different variables. For example, the min length and max length you could put in there as well. So grab this number right here instead of you having to type it out again. The property name, the property value as well. So you can grab these different parameters and put them into your string directly with the curly braces around them and create some really nice error messages for your users. All right, so we've done this for one field, the first name. Let's do it for last name. I'm going to copy this whole thing and paste. And yeah, it sounds redundant, but we may be treating last name differently, so creating a similar rule set is okay. And notice since we use property name everywhere, I didn't have to redo these strings. Now also notice that the with message, we also have with localized message. So if you are dealing with an application that needs to have localization, this is a way to use a localized message and adjust for whatever language you're displaying your information in. So it's not just, in this case, just English. You could have Spanish or French or whatever by using the localized string. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but just know that's there because, yes, these string messages are a little scary in the fact that they're just one language. All right, so let's just make sure this runs. So I'm going to say, now notice that the cascade mode is stop on first failure. So I'll just put a 1 in account balance and hit create. Notice that first name is empty and last name is empty. So just note, cascade mode only applies to the rule it's in. So even though we stopped after this right here, that was for this rule. And we stopped after this one for this rule. So just note that even if you do a cascade mode for your entire validator, which you can do, like a global for this whole validator, it still is per rule. It's not like if the first rule stops, no other rule gets run. All right. And part of the reason for that is because this validator can run asynchronously if you want it to. And so it would run these rules in parallel. So that's why you can't say if one fails, the other stop, because then you get inconsistent results as to which one stops everything else. Now, there is a way, I'm not going to cover it in this video, but the documentation on this site is great. So you can go and see how to do it. There is a way to nest rules so that if you do the first check and it fails, then you don't do other checks on other properties even. So there's ways of doing that. But in general, we just stack the rules like this, and then they'll get run in parallel if you're doing asynchronously. All right, last rule, just to kind of show something a little bit different. So let's create a rule for, and we're going to say P in the arrow function, P dot date of birth. And we're going to say that this one, we're not going to worry about cascading for this, but we'll say must be a valid age. Okay. Now I don't have that yet. I'm going to create that. And we'll do a with message. And we'll say invalid. And we'll put the proper name, which would be date of birth. Now, yes, it's yelling at me. So I'll go ahead and create that protected bool. And we'll say it's going to date time. We'll call it date. So date you're passing, and we're going to check to make sure this is valid. So the first thing I'll do is I'll grab the year of this year. So it'd be 2018. So int year, let's call it current year, equals DateTime dot now dot year. So it's getting 2018. Then I'm going to check to see if the year on the date is valid. So we'll actually grab that year as well. So we'll say DOB year, date of birth year, equals date.year. So now we have these 2 years to compare. And all I want to make sure is that the date of birth year isn't in the future. So it's not 2019 or beyond. And all I want to check as well is that the date of birth year is not more than 120 years ago. So if current year, let's actually say date of birth year is less than or equal to the current year. If that's true, then that's good. And the date of birth year is greater than the current year minus 120. Okay, so there's our 2 different checks. If it's less than or equal to this year, and if it's greater than 120 years ago. If both of those are true, return true. I can come down here and return false. Now, I could have put that in else, but the reality is this return stops it right here. So it only gets here if it was false. So it's up to you if you want to do that or not. The other thing I could have done is I could have just returned this right here. I don't find that very easy to read because it kind of has to make you think a little bit what's going on. Whereas with this, I can breakpoint it, I can look through it, and it's just a little easier and it's a little more understandable. So I don't typically do that, but remember, any if statement, the result is a true or a false value. So in theory, you could return that value and it'd be true or false, and that's what we're looking for. So now you have this be a valid age. So date of birth must be a valid age with message invalid date of birth. Let's try it. So let's test and 1, 2, 3. Now the date, let's leave it as correct, and that passes. Let's move it into January 1st of 2019. Invalid date of birth. let's move it back to, oh, I don't know. Actually, I could probably change it in the picker easier. So let's do this. Let's say 1934. That's fine. But now what if we did the 1800s? 1866. That's an invalid date of birth. Okay? So that gives you a little more information about, kind of bracketing in something, or in other ways of kind of limiting the data that comes through and making sure that it's valid data. So we have three different rules, or three different rule sets. One for first name, one for last name. Those are similar, basically the same. And one for date of birth. So all you have to do to add more validation is just add more rules into this constructor. That's it. If you want to create more custom rules, no problem. Just create these little bits right here. And it's just pass in the value, pass back a Boolean as to whether or not it's valid. So you don't have to put these in your validator. You can put them outside of that and have this for your entire application to share. So you could create these anywhere, like in public instead of protected, probably. But what this would do is allow you to, make name validators that can use anywhere in any model validation, not just in this specific one. You could even make a company-wide one, or create something in a NuGet package where you can create your own standard validators that go with the standard validators that come with the Fluent validation. Okay? So don't think you're limited to putting it inside of this particular validator. You can bring them outside. Now, there's a lot more they could cover. I'm not going to, because I want to get you started in this. So, get in, get your hands dirty, try it out, make your own validators, try some different data types, maybe validate that account balance or other things as well. And just try and figure it all out, because if you don't use it, then you don't really grasp it necessarily, or it doesn't click as well. Okay? So try it out. And then once you get it, then what I want you to do is I want you to go to the website and read the documentation, because there's so much more that you could learn about. And the documentation is excellent. So go to this website, fluentvalidation.net, and there'll be information there that will cover some of the more detailed aspects of Fluent validation. Okay? Things like if you have models inside your models, or lists of models, those type of things. So definitely check it out once you kind of start to use this. And this will probably come up in one of my future weekly challenges, because it seems like something that you should try out, because validation is very important. So figure out a way to make your validation easy and yet powerful, and yet also you have that ability to be dry doing it. And I think this one, Fluent Validation, fits all those criteria, and it's just great. So try it out and let me know what you think down in the comments below. All right, I appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.